Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's a real honor. This part of the presentation is intended to provide an overview history of evolving approaches to designing public landscapes in Toronto, explored through significant sites and practitioners, and defined by the cultural ideas and influences at play at various periods in the city's history. My talk starts with the early colonial period, with the small town of York situated on the bay, and brings us through various eras to the present period of the modern, bustling cosmopolitan metropolis that we inhabit today. Perhaps the most significant shapers of Toronto's landscape were the colonial surveyors, who carved the physical and some would argue psychological framework of the city into the landscape in the late 18th century. But before that period, this landscape, long inhabited by native nations, first shows up on 17th century French maps, known as the site of a portage route important to the fur trade, connecting Lake Ontario to the upper Great Lakes via the Humber and Holland rivers, known as the Toronto Carrying Place Trail. The British claim ownership of the territory that becomes Toronto through the 1787 Toronto Purchase, outlined in this map. You can see the Carrying Place Trail drawn on that map as well, between the British Crown and the Mississauga of New Credit. This is an unbuilt conceptual town plan for the site that would become Toronto from 1788 by surveyor Gother Mann. It is noteworthy for its urban design, which anticipates the future needs of the city with squares, prominent sites for public buildings, and a bold, expansive common between the town center and larger rural lots beyond. In an example of colonial cross-pollination within the Commonwealth, the same plan, more or less, is implemented nearly 50 years later in William Light's famous plan for Adelaide, South Australia, a city celebrated for its influential park system. In 1791, another surveyor named Augustus Jones was assigned to lay out waterfront townships along the north shore of Lake Ontario, from the Bay of Quinte in the east to what would become Toronto in the west. Working through the dense and continuous forests of Upper Canada, surveyors used a measuring instrument called Gunter's chain, measuring 66 feet and 6 inches, to lay out what we know of today as the concession grid, composed of east-west concession roads and north-south side roads, approximately 2 kilometers apart. A grid of 1,000-acre land parcels subdivided into smaller lots was created across this section of the province. The first concession in Toronto, which you can see along the bottom there, now Queen Street, then known as Lot Street, is visible running east-west just above the lake. To the south, lots defined by an uneven shoreline were known as the Broken Front. With the land framework of the waterfront townships established, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, arrives with his family in the summer of 1793, and this is a watercolor by his wife, Elizabeth Simcoe. In the context of the looming threat of invasion by the recently independent United States, Simcoe is impressed by the natural defensive qualities of the sheltered harbor. He establishes Fort York across from the peninsula, now the islands, to guard entry, and with the survey of Alexander Aiken, lays out 10 small blocks for a town at the east end of the basin. Surrounding the town blocks within the Broken Front, between the first concession and the waterfront, Simcoe sets aside reserve land for the Crown. Running north between Lot Street and the second concession, which is off the map here, but close to where we are right now, Bloor Street, are 32 park lots. Each park lot, measuring 100 acres, is made available to an elite class of citizens who would go on to play prominent roles in government and in civic leadership in the coming decades as an enticement to settle the new town. Zooming out, this diagram shows the skinnier 32 park lots surrounded by larger 200-acre town lots, a structure which goes on to guide the development of Toronto for the next 200 years. To borrow from an analysis by Toronto urban designer and architect Ken Greenberg, rather than pursuing the abstract ideal embedded in the unexecuted Gother Mann plan, Toronto is founded on a pragmatic and expedient land division pattern tailored to the immediate needs and modest resources of the period, with no conception of a larger vision for the city. Toronto's incredible growth and success, despite this lack of a vision in its original land framework, is a central premise of John Fulford's often referenced book about Toronto, The Accidental City. The park lot grid established by Aiken and Simcoe paid little attention to the contours and natural features of the landscape, many of which have been lost to us over time, filled in and buried in sewers in the interest of efficient land subdivision and urbanization. Some thinkers, like Toronto architect and planner John Van Nostrand, have observed that the lack of engagement between the colonial grid and the unique ravine landscapes of Toronto has deeply affected Torontonians' psychological connection to our landscape, and have argued that reconnecting with this landscape is essential for Toronto to establish a truly independent local culture that is rooted in its place. This next sequence of slides shows the next phase of urbanization in Toronto within the Broken Front Crown Reserve lands. The city first expanded to the west with larger blocks and the provision of sites for public spaces and public buildings, such as the market site that has evolved into today's St. Lawrence Market. Eastward expansion in the 1830s created a working-class industrial district by the Don River, which came to be known as Corktown, a district being redeveloped today by waterfront Toronto, and the site of a series of incredible new parks and open spaces, which we'll be talking about later today, including MVVA's Corktown Common. Following the creation of a new fort further to the west, westward expansion of the town was made possible up to the edges of Garrison Creek, on the left side of the slide there, within the former ordnance lands of Fort York. This district plan from 1837, laid out with a series of park squares, influenced by town planning ideas from the UK, such as James Craig's 1768 plan for Edinburgh's New Town, created a unique dumbbell pattern of park squares that are now known as Victoria Memorial Square to the west and Clarence Square to the east, linked by a boulevard called Wellington Place. Owned by the Crown, the incremental expansion of the town south of Lott Street was able to incorporate urban qualities and components lacking in the original plan with the 10 blocks. As we will see in the next section, the urbanization of the park lots, which were all under private ownership, proceeded in a less planned manner, largely dictated by market forces and the visions of individual landowners, a pretty unique pattern. Professional shapers of Toronto's public landscapes in the Victorian period were largely self-identified as landscape gardeners and had training in the old world countries of Europe. This diagram, which I'm still refining, attempts to show Toronto's population growth over time compared to several major US cities that with Toronto make up the recently coined Great Lakes megalopolis, Buffalo, Chicago, and Detroit, as well as with Canada's much older and first major city, Montreal, and with New York and London. What the diagram attempts to illustrate is that unlike New York in the first half of the 19th century, or Chicago in the second half of the 19th century, both of which grew at absolutely astounding rates to incredible sizes during these periods, Toronto has experienced significant but fairly steady growth over that time. In fact, Toronto today is approximately the size of Chicago in the 1920s, New York in the 1890s, and London in the 1860s. The well-documented urban squalor created by the sheer speed of urbanization and the overall scale of those cities created an urgency for public health solutions which simply did not exist to the same degree in Toronto during that period. Following Olmsted and Vaux's Greensward plan for Central Park in 1858, the first official use of the term landscape architect by the US government is dated to 1863. The ASLA is established in 1899, and professional university programs are established as early as 1900 at Harvard, all points which speak to the level of professionalization of the practice of landscape architecture in the US during this period, in large part due to the intense conditions in the major urban cities. While the first public parks start to emerge in Toronto very shortly after those in Britain and around the time of those in the US, they emerge more due to an appreciation for the philosophy and values associated with them as a nice to have, rather than as the solution to urgent urban crises. It's later, more in the 1880s and 1890s, that a true park movement starts to emerge in Toronto. In the end, Toronto does not inherit a bold system of sophisticated parks and open spaces to match those that Olmsted designed for Chicago, Buffalo, and Boston in this period, for instance. Instead, the design landscapes of this period, many of which Toronto still has today, evolved through the incremental subdivision of the park lot framework laid down in the 1790s, and the engagement of professional landscape gardeners. Embodied within them are a rich history of ideas that tell important stories about the unique shape and evolution of Toronto. This bird's eye drawing of 1886 Toronto identifies a handful of significant design landscapes from the Victorian period. This drawing shows the grounds at the bottom of Osgoode Hall, and then, of course, what becomes University Avenue is also visible, the first incarnation, leading up to what would become Queen's Park and the University of Toronto. A second promenade running east along what is now called College Avenue to Yonge Street was also constructed as an approach to the university grounds. Little known today, in the late 1820s, the founders of the University of Toronto hired Belgian-born, Brooklyn-based landscape gardener André Parmentier to design a promenade leading to the just acquired property that would become the university grounds, as well as a scheme for the grounds themselves. Records indicate that Parmentier, recognized as a preeminent figure in American landscape history through his influence on Andrew Jackson Downing and later on Frederick Law Olmsted, was also engaged at this time to lay out the grounds of Moss Park estate on the Allen Park lot further to the east, which Charles has already mentioned. The promenade had access controlled by entry gates at the north and south, featured double rows of flowering horse chestnuts, a central roadway, and flanking carriageways. In 1893, the Ontario legislature was constructed at the north end of the boulevard, creating an architectural focal point and changing the relationship between the promenade and the university grounds, this portion of which had become one of the first public parks in Upper Canada, Queen's Park, established in 1860. This is another important site in the history of the city that I actually didn't know much about until pretty recently. For a project influenced by the leadership of education reformer Egerton Ryerson, Scottish-born landscape gardener William Mundy was hired in 1852 to design the grounds of the Normal and Model School, a teacher training academy that is known as the cradle of Ontario's education system, due in part to the fact that the Royal Ontario Museum, the Ontario College of Art and Design, and the Ontario Agricultural College, which has been in Guelph since the late 19th century, all originated on its campus. Influenced by the Victorian interest in the scientific study of plants through botany and horticulture, and through the writings of John Claudius Loudon in London about the garden-esque style, Mundy laid out the 3.2-acre campus landscape as a botanical garden with over 200 plant species, a fruit garden, a greenhouse, an area for agricultural experimentation, and settings for playing fields and gymnastics. The intent was to create a refined and inspirational setting for inquisitive students, and the campus was so successful that it functioned for many years as a quasi-public space known as St. James Square. The buildings and grounds were demolished in the late 1950s to make way for the Kerr Hall quadrangle building at the heart of the Ryerson campus today. Allen Gardens emerged out of Park Lot 5 in the east part of downtown Toronto. This is a slide showing the evolution of that park lot over time, starting in 1818 all the way through to the present day. Starting in the 1860s, a subdivision plan is developed for the park lot, which at that time is home to the Homewood Estate to the north and the Moss Park Estate to the south, which we mentioned earlier, having an association with Parmentier in the 1830s, that is. Known today as the Garden District, two central streets with gracious lots, Homewood to the north and Pembroke to the south, were laid out on axis with a central open space for the district, which under the leadership of the Toronto Horticultural Society established in the 1830s, would create what would originally be known as the Botanical Garden and what is now known as Allen Gardens. One interesting tidbit that I think a lot of locals know, but if any visitors are going to make it out to Allen Gardens, are the two curved shapes that you see in the road framework on the right-hand side of the slide. That's a curve that is now in Dundas on the south and a curve in Wellesley to the north. Those were in response to the estate houses that were actually part of the park lot and originated before the subdivision plan was there. It's a legacy of that plan that most of us don't recognize as an important part of the history of the city. Laid out by Edwin Taylor, who trained with Joseph Paxton in the UK, Allen Gardens was also laid out in the Victorian garden-esque tradition and was a place of learning and inspiration for the larger city, influencing taste through the promotion of horticulture and public lectures. Oscar Wilde did a lecture circuit through North America and came to Toronto in the 1880s and spoke at Allen Gardens, for example. Today, the park remains a gem in the downtown east side of Toronto, but it can fairly be said that it no longer plays as prominent a cultural role in the imagination of the city and is ripe for thoughtful revitalization. This image shows the site of today's Queen's Park and the University of Toronto back in the 1870s, with the now buried Tattle Creek and McCall's Pond highlighted in blue. Parmentier's Promenade can be seen to the bottom of the image. This 1859 unattributed plan for the university grounds to the west of the creek and for Queen's Park on the right is thought to be associated with landscape designer William Mundy, who was associated with the Normal School, based on earlier plans by Parmentier. This view across McCall's Pond with Cumberland and Storm's 1859 University College visible in the background depicts the picturesque character of the ravine landscape. Following the filling of Tattle Creek in the 1880s, this view from Queen's Park west towards University College illustrates the curving carriageways, rolling lawns, picturesque tree groupings, and landscape continuity of this period between Queen's Park and the university grounds. This is the same view today. Looking west from Wellesley, you can see University College in the background. Assembled out of the northern part of three park lots, the University of Toronto and Queen's Park have evolved dramatically over the past 2 centuries. The legislature effectively bisected Queen's Park, creating a front and back condition, and changed the relationship of the precinct with University Avenue. The incremental encroachment of roadways have also fundamentally changed the character and function. However, the precinct retains a distinctly picturesque quality that serves as a strong juxtaposition to the surrounding city. We're essentially in this zone right now. And I'm sure you'll all agree with this morning's beautiful sunlight. It's a pretty fantastic part of the city. The early 20th century was a period of rapid growth in Toronto, and inspired by city beautiful ideas from Chicago's 1893 World's Fair and Garden City ideas from the UK, this was a period of reform-mindedness. This period sees the establishment of several private landscape architecture firms in Toronto, most notably the firm of husband and wife team Dunnington Grubb, both from the UK and trained in London and at Cornell. The Dunnington Grubbs were involved with the layout and design of Lawrence Park in this period, an early and locally influential garden suburb. But much of their work from this period was for private estate grounds. Frederick Todd, perhaps Canada's most significant landscape architect from this period, laid out Leaside, an influential residential and industrial district in 1912. In terms of public parks, however, this period in Toronto's development is largely guided by the newly established Parks Department, and like in other cities, the focus of design is moving away from designing passive spaces with naturalistic scenery toward a focus on recreation and the provision of facilities for various active uses. This map from 1915 shows Toronto's steady growth in the lead up to World War I and the annexation of a number of adjacent townships into the city. This 1908 plan, produced by the Toronto Guild of Civic Art, a citizen group of architects, artists, and civic leaders, shows the existing park system and proposed a number of new parks and playgrounds, greenways, waterfront parks, and the creation of several radial boulevards, as well as the rationalization of a number of east-west streets south of Bloor and north of Queen, those kind of between the two concession roads, that did not line up and thus caused traffic congestion due to the piecemeal and uncoordinated urbanization of the park lots during the preceding decades. Toronto during this period was still overwhelmed by a dominant culture of puritanical Protestantism, exemplified in this poster outlining all of the behaviors and activities banned from public spaces on Sundays. The sign on the right, posted in Christie Pitts, warns that persons disturbing the turf in this park in search of mushrooms will be prosecuted. Meanwhile, private pleasure resorts, where apparently more fun was to be had, could be enjoyed on the islands at Hanlon Point, shown in the image above, or at places like Kew Gardens and the beach. These next several images illustrate the focus from this period on the creation of facilities in old and new parks for active recreation. That's Riverdale Park for the Don Valley Parkway, looking south. And this is Withrow Park when it's first getting constructed in the beginning of the 20th century. As Dina Marie alluded to in her presentation, major lake filling operations are occurring at an industrial scale during this period in anticipation of the creation of the modern port to take advantage of the promised St. Lawrence Seaway. The bottom image is looking southeast across the east central waterfront. The site of today's Sugar Beach and Sherbourne Common are more or less in that area that is depicted as water in this photograph from the 1920s. Around 1950, Toronto's population had reached that of Montreal at about 1.2 million people, and a post-war housing shortage ushered in an era of phenomenal suburbanization beyond the boundaries of the old city. A new metropolitan government was created in 1954, following shortly thereafter by the formation of the conservation authorities as a response to the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel. Numerous architects, planners, and landscape architects fleeing post-war Europe arrived in Toronto with fresh ideas, some finding prominent roles within government and private practice. Post-war immigration from Europe and Asia brought many thousands of people to Toronto with differing urban traditions and values about how city life could be enjoyed through parks and public spaces in this period. By the mid-60s, Toronto and Canada were in the midst of a major period of optimistic country building, where massive public investment was going into old and the formation of new institutions and urban renewal projects, and Expo 67 in Montreal had boldly promoted Canadian culture and design on the international stage. The new mode of this Canadian coming-of-age period was modernist, exemplified in the new architecture as well as in the landscape architecture of the period. After the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects had been established by a group of founding practitioners in Toronto in 1934, all trained abroad, professional programs were now set up in the post-war period in Guelph in 1964 and Toronto in 1965. Probably the most significant and certainly the most iconic Toronto project from this period is Viljo Revel's International Design Competition entry for the new City Hall and the accompanying Nathan Phillips Square, designed in partnership with landscape architect Richard Strong. This was Toronto's first public plaza, and it embodied a more urbane and civilized view of the city as a place to live as well as work in. Don Mills, planned in 1954 by landscape architect Macklin Hancock, who trained under Walter Gropius at Harvard, set the new model for modernist Newtown development and went on to influence residential subdivision planning throughout Canada. Hancock's firm, Project Planning Associates, completed a major project at Centre Island for Metro Parks, the first comprehensive park development program on the Toronto Islands, parts of which had been dedicated to public park use starting in the 1880s. Opened in the mid-70s, Ontario Place, designed by Eb Zeidler and landscape architect Michael Huff, represented Toronto's response to Montreal's Expo 67 and created bold new ways of engaging with the waterfront. Now we're revisiting University Avenue again. This is a view looking north up University Avenue toward the legislature from the 1930s. By the mid-50s, all of the trees planted by Parmentier were gone, lost largely to the interest of widening the roadway to accommodate increasing traffic. In the mid-60s, in conjunction with a new subway being constructed underneath, and in the context of Nathan Phillips Square being developed and other connections happening and making a larger sort of urban renewal precinct in this part of the city, the firm of Dunnington, Grubb and Stenson is hired by the city to develop a new design that would bring a sense of dignity back to Toronto's Grand Avenue. Stenson, the junior partner, had trained at Harvard and had a significant influence on the design, which is strikingly modern. The project features 12 garden islands ascending 75 feet up the gradual slope of the former Lake Iroquois lake bed and tapering from 50 feet wide at the south end to 25 feet at the north. Sequences of steps, terraces, and garden walls animate the gardens while making up the grade. A host of inventive precast exposed aggregate concrete and stone panels clad many of the walls, and decorative patterns define the pavements. While these materials unify the larger scheme, there is a great variation between each garden island, each consciously designed to appear as though a different designer was involved. This is a view north at Edward Street from the late 1960s, and this is the same view today. Unfortunately, the project brief did not allow for a treatment of the east and west sides of the boulevard, and traffic requirements for east-west movement eliminated the historic experience in the Parmentier era of promenading up and down the boulevard, a program that surely would help animate many of the isolated garden islands today. Despite the fact that thousands of people drive up and down it on a daily basis, and despite a considerable annual planting program for many of the planters, Dunnington Grub and Stenson's University Avenue has degraded considerably and is in need of significant reinvestment. There's no question that this is a very significant work of civic landscape architecture, and it is my hope that the ideas embedded in its design will be understood and reevaluated when conversations inevitably arise around its future. These are some of the other major projects from this period. Today, Toronto has emerged as the fourth largest city in North America and boasts a robust economy, a thriving arts and culture scene, and a growth forecast that anticipates the GTA growing by about 130,000 residents per year until 2030. All of this growth has fueled a prolonged housing boom that has seen a remarkable amount of development focused in downtown, which you've heard about. This map shows development proposals by height in the downtown between 2008 and 2013, an area which has literally doubled in resident population between 1976 and today, let alone the daytime population with all of the workers coming in and tourists and so on. This population growth, as well as new and expanding demands for different kinds of park amenities like dog parks, is placing a great deal of pressure on a fragile system of parks and open spaces. Meanwhile, on the waterfront and along the Don Valley, new public space projects are emerging of a caliber unprecedented in Toronto's history. These projects are built robustly to withstand the heavy use of a large, complex city, perform ecosystem services, restore our connection to our local landscape, and elegantly accommodate demanding active use programs within settings of aesthetic beauty. In short, it appears as though the sophisticated level of public realm landscape thinking that emerged in major US cities in the late 19th century is now playing out along Toronto's waterfront. Close to 100 Friends of Parks groups have been organized in the last several years, while numerous reports calling for broader thinking about making and managing our landscapes have been published. The mainstream media is beginning to talk about these issues on a regular basis. Beyond the downtown core, where development investment is less focused and less money is available for parks and public realm improvements, different new models are needed for different parts of the city. We are clearly at a moment in our history where a major conversation about the future of Toronto's public realm is emerging, and I hope that today's conference and this weekend's events become a major catalyst for this discussion. To conclude, Toronto has a rich and layered landscape history that is steeped with cultural narratives and embedded values. Thank you.